Aaron, thanks so much for joining us this week.
Yeah, good to be here.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you founded so many companies, Quays, Alta Rock, Polpis, Wacomet. I mean, there's something really unique about repeat founders like you. And just curiously, what do you think it is about someone who just keeps going back to the drawing board time after time and keeps, wanting to solve new problems, or just want to know what makes you guys tick?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think at some level it's maybe a little bit irrational. I think you have to be a little bit crazy, just sort of enjoy the pain type of thing.
Yeah.
But in the cases of the things that I've done in the companies that I've been fortunate enough to be a part of, I truly believe in the solution. I think we're talking about some really massive opportunities, in energy and in water. And once you see it, it's sort of hard to look away. And so I think I see an enormous opportunity for geothermal energy. I see an absolutely enormous opportunity for mass scale desalination. And I've sort of studied and developed the technology for long enough to know that it's truly possible. It's truly within reach. And yeah, I just feel like we can solve it no matter how long it takes.
I mean, yeah, I'd love to dive into kind of your two most recent companies the most. Maybe start with Pulpus a bit. Can you just explain what you guys are doing, your kind of unique approach when it comes to geothermal and its advantages over so many other approaches out there?
Yeah, so with Polpis systems, what we're trying to do is really simplify next generation geothermal, deep geothermal energy. So right now, state of the art for advanced geothermal is what's called EGS, enhanced geothermal systems. And the challenge with enhanced geothermal systems is there's a lot of complexity in trying to engineer a reservoir, basically create a reservoir where you're circulating a very large volume of hot fluid. You need the wells to be drilled correctly. You need the fractures to be sort of connected correctly, and it becomes increasingly more complex and challenging in high temperature and high pressure environments. And so a pulpit system is what we're going to attempt to do is to dramatically simplify that to a single well, basically a mono well, so that you can produce geothermal with a single well. You're still going to need to have an engineered reservoir below it, but basically be injecting and producing the fluid in the same well so that you don't have to have the risk of drilling and connecting a geothermal well multiplied over sometimes two or three or even four wells. So the goal is really to simplify it, make it very reproducible across different sites and different geologic conditions, and then obviously to dramatically reduce the cost.
I mean, we've been on this just road to needing more and more energy from, and mankind's always had this relentless pursuit for it. We're going from wood burning to fossil fuels to nuclear, and now I'd love to kind of just get your ideas where you see geothermal fitting into things over the next decade and honestly century. I mean, with our breakthrough science roadmap, we try to chart out everything between today and 2050, and really want to get your perspective on where you see geothermal going in the next 30 years or so.
Yeah, I mean, I think geothermal is an enormous opportunity for the United States because it's a domestic resource, one. Two, it leans very heavily on oil and gas expertise, right? Drilling,
Yeah.
hydraulic fracturing, production, cementing wells. So there's an enormous sort of technical base of expertise that geothermal can build on, even though we do have to go to much higher temperatures and more severe conditions. And thirdly, it has a totally different risk and regulatory profile than nuclear, right? So there's no NRC for geothermal. It's an existing industry where we're building and drilling geothermal wells on a regular basis. So I think it's a sort of a really important hedge against nuclear because I think there is still some uncertainty in terms of how much nuclear we can build, how quickly the public is going to get comfortable with it, whether we're going to be able to shift to fusion and stuff like that. So I think geothermal is a really important bet from that standpoint. But the key for geothermal is that it really needs to scale beyond what is sort of a cottage, industry right now. It needs to scale beyond just easily accessible geothermal resources to what's referred to in the industry as hot dry rock. So drilling basically anywhere where you have temperature under the ground, but you don't have a naturally occurring geothermal resource, and turning that into electric power. And that's going to be sort of the real key that will determine whether or not geothermal can really scale and rise to the challenge of hundreds, thousands of gigawatts of power that we're going to need.
I mean, on the point of scale, or maybe just talk a little bit about the potential of it, because with geothermal, you could power the world, which was or power, I guess, the U.S. 2,000 times over in terms of total energy demand. I've seen some studies saying that, and that's just like a very conservative estimate. So when you and geothermal is only like 0.2% of the existing U.S. energy mix. So how do you get it to be, even a couple percent ends up being a pretty dramatic impact on costs in some places? I mean, how do you kind of get from that 0.2% to 2, 3, 5% of the overall U.S. energy mix?
Yeah, I mean, the trick with geothermal is that obviously there's a mind-boggling amount of heat under the ground. But there's a couple of things. One is, how much of that heat is economically recoverable. So you
Right.
really have to talk about not just the thermal resource, but what is economically recoverable. And then the second piece is what is the cost, right? Because um, obviously, the deeper you drill, the more heat you're going to get. But today, there's a lot of geothermal resources that are not yet accessible until we can really advance drilling and bring down the cost. So one of the companies that I was involved in starting previously, Quays, is obviously working on an alternative approach to drilling very deep and keeping the cost down as you get to those depths. But initially, geothermal or next generation geothermal is going to have to focus on locations where you can find high temperature heat at shallow depths that don't necessarily require advanced drilling or new forms of drilling. And that's where I think the biggest opportunity is. Because right now there are still high temperature geothermal sites, and there's some folks that are developing those today, where you can get to what's called supercritical conditions at relatively modest depths. Not something that requires a breakthrough in drilling, but something where with conventional drilling, even though it may be a little bit more expensive initially, you can tap into conditions where the fluid is going to be supercritical, and you're going to get very, very high density power out of the well. And one of the things that you mentioned just a few minutes ago is the transition, from wood to hydrocarbons to nuclear. And one of at least from my perspective, I think one of the super important truths in the energy space is that most technological progression happens in the direction of increasing power density, right? Hydrocarbons
Yeah.
have higher power density than wood. Nuclear has a higher power density than hydrocarbons for the most part. And I think geothermal, similarly, if we can increase the temperatures and the pressures at which we produce, we can get to the point where we're producing ideally 10 times more power than existing geothermal wells. And so I think if we can get to that power density, it does become very competitive with nuclear. And I think you can easily see how it's something that can step into the shoes of hydrocarbons, because we still produce the majority of our energy from hydrocarbons.
You talk a little bit about the site selection, where you're finding those, like the shallow reservoirs you're talking about. I mean, where in the U.S. you think those are the kind of the most likely places for geothermal to evolve? There's someone listening in the Midwest, somewhere in the West Coast or Northeast. They're wondering, is this a potential for my state, my community? Where do you see most of the activity actually happening around the U.S. and globally, for that matter?
Yeah, so in terms of high temperature sites, right now they are kind of few and far between. So there hasn't been an enormous amount of development just yet in the United States for high temperature geothermal resources. But there are a few. So in Northern California, in the geysers, which is one of the regions that we're looking at, the geysers is the largest geothermal resource in the world, actually. And so the geysers has kind of a naturally occurring traditional hydrothermal geothermal resource. It's shallow, but if you drill down below it, you can get to super hot or supercritical geothermal. So that's one of the locations we're looking at where we could sort of drill a little bit deeper, not crazy depths, but get below the existing resource and try and produce that. There's locations like in my previous company, Alterock has been for a long time developing a site called Newberry, which is up in Oregon, which is on the flank of the Newberry volcano. So it's a place where you have just a very high temperature gradient because it's a volcano. But if you step out from that, there's areas where Alterock drilled, I think it was a 10,000 foot well that was at about 320 degrees C, so pretty hot. Um, and then obviously if you drill deeper, you can start to produce high temperature geothermal anywhere, but that's gonna require time. And then one of the other sites that we're looking at is the Forge geothermal site, which is managed by the Department of Energy. So Forge is a test site for exploring new geothermal technologies, and they've got a pretty good facility there for testing different approaches.
Yeah, super helpful. Switching gears a bit to desalination, I mean, can you explain a little bit about what Wacomet's up to and your guys' approach for, or compared to traditional desal, and what advantages it has? Actually, maybe you should even explain where all of your company names for. I think that'd be an interesting little factoid for many listeners.
Yeah, I grew up in Massachusetts, spending my summers in Nantucket. So all the companies or most of the companies that I started have all been named after places on Nantucket. It was the only way I could come up with sort of creative, unique names. So yeah, Wacomet, Alterock, Polpis, Quays, Quidnet, those are all places on Nantucket.
Yeah, bonus points for any listener or investor who picked up on that. Yeah, if you can, yeah, on the desal front, maybe just give listeners a little bit of an update where you guys are at and your kind of unique approach there as well.
Yeah, so I'm a huge believer in desalination. I think it's an extremely important technology, and I think we sort of take for granted water availability a little bit. We sort of look at it as this resource that's just kind of there. There's a finite amount of it. Whatever we get, we get. If we're using too much, we have to cut back. And so about let's see, it was about 5 years ago, I moved out to California, and I started spending a lot of time in the Central Valley, where the sort of major agricultural operations are. And the Central Valley of California is really incredible because it's this area that has imported water, which if it didn't have it, would basically just be desert. And I was just blown away with the water challenges that they were facing there because every year they're getting less and less water, and they were looking at trying to implement desalination as a way to treat. They have local, just brackish water or water that's wasted or drained from agricultural operations that just picks up salt, naturally occurring salts in the ground, and they were trying to figure out if they could use that as a much more reliable source of water instead of fallowing land. And I was just absolutely struck by how big the opportunity is to use desalination to kind of bring water reliability and water availability back. And so that's when I started sort of focusing on what technology is really needed in order for desalination to scale. Obviously, we have desalination today. Florida, Texas, California, countries like Israel and Singapore do a lot of desalination. But what's the reason why we aren't using desalination as a primary source of water? And there's really a couple of things. One is obviously that it takes a lot of energy. It takes a lot of electricity, which has a big part in the cost. The second is that coastal land is not easy to come by, and understandably so. People don't want large scale desalination plants, blocking valuable coastline. And then the other big part is that it produces an enormous amount of brine discharge. It produces effluent, high salinity brine that has to go somewhere, has to go back out in the ocean. So what we're trying to do at Wacomet is relieve or remove those barriers to scaling desalination. So focus on getting the energy efficiency up, and improving the environmental impact by eliminating the brine. And the way we do that is by going to a completely new membraneless desalination approach. So we're going to use solvents and different separation techniques that don't require traditional reverse osmosis membrane to separate fresh water. And we're gonna use those same processes to basically get to very high water recovery where you don't have a lot of brine discharge, or you recover the salt as a solid entirely. And so we're right now in sort of the piloting phase. We've got a couple of pilots that we're working on to demonstrate. Initially, we probably focus on industrial brines, things where there's sort of a higher willingness to pay for removing brines, but then ultimately move down the scale to desalination.
You previously wrote a piece about the need. You were advocating for basically a Department of Water that it's such an important natural resource, and yet regulatory wise, there's just not enough attention on it. This is coming at a time when there's fewer departments, fewer agencies in the Trump administration, or like everything's on the chopping block. I mean, I imagine you're still out there advocating, and this is something that we really should be putting the type of focus and really need a national water strategy. And can you kind of dive into that a bit, or just what needs to happen at the national or at the federal, state, and local levels for us to really get water policy right in this country?
Yeah, I do think it needs to start at the top. I think we need to
Yeah.
start looking at water a lot more like we look at energy, where it's really of great strategic national interest to make sure that we protect the water resources and we have adequate water. I mean, California is the fifth largest economy in the world,
Yeah.
and it's short water to the point where, and I think a lot of people don't realize this, but to the point where agriculture is really consolidating, and a lot of land is being fallowed, right? So we're going to start, purchasing food from other places instead of getting it from California. And a lot of housing development and just building cities is tied to the availability of water. And so you cannot build large scale developments or new cities in California unless you can show a 50 to 100-year water supply. And that just isn't there. So you have a situation where you have this massive amount of potential economic production, which is totally being held back by water availability. And I think that's something that requires a cohesive national strategy. And right now, so right now, water in the United States is managed by the Bureau of Reclamation, and the Bureau of Reclamation was set up specifically to reclaim the land in the arid West. It was created to basically make use of all this unusable arid desert land in the West. It's how we created California. But if you look at what the Bureau of Reclamation is doing now, it's really not sort of fulfilling that promise anymore. It's actually unfortunate, but it's sort of doing the opposite. It's allowing land to be fallowed. It's paying farmers to leave water in the river and not produce the crops that, and the food that we need for this country. So in my view, the Bureau of Reclamation is really not serving the interests um, that it should anymore. And so, yeah, personally, if I was in charge, what would I like to see happen? I think the Bureau of Reclamation should largely go away. I think the Department of Interior can manage the existing water assets, infrastructure, canals, dams, lakes, hydroelectric facilities that are under the Bureau of Reclamation. I think it could be sort of consolidated underneath the Department of Interior and really in its place. And you can call it a standalone Department of Water, but you could also just think of it as being a division of the Department of Energy. Because at the end of the day, it's really technology that's going to drive the supply of water going forward. We don't have any more water that we can just tap into in rivers or lakes. We've tapped that supply out. So the only future water that we're going to get is going to come from making it, and making it is desalination. And we have an unlimited amount of salt water that we can tap into. There's absolutely no reason why we should be short of water in California or anywhere in the United States. I mean, we live on the water planet. I mean, the very reason why there's intelligent life on Earth is because there's water here. The majority of it is salt water. And so, yeah, I think if we had a federal strategy to create a network of desalination plants to ensure that we actually get back to the original mission of the Bureau of Reclamation, which is to grow the water supply, not shrink the water supply, then I think that what would result from that is I think you could actually start talking about new cities. I think you could start talking about, terraforming, desert land, and occupying parts of the country that are just totally uninhabitable. And I think you can start to imagine how we're going to support all these absolutely massive data centers that are coming down the pipe because they use an enormous amount of water for cooling and for the energy supply. And I'm not sure where that water is going to come from right now because we're already sort of constrained. So yeah, I mean I don't know if we necessarily need a standalone Department of Water, but I would love to see a national strategy or a national focus on being a leader in increasing the water supply through desalination, much like Israel has done over the past several decades. I mean, obviously Israel is a very small country. To pull it off in the United States, it's going to have to be done differently. We're going to have to be very thoughtful about where the energy comes from, right? Because we can't just start using enormous amounts of energy that would otherwise go to homes and to cities. We have to be very thoughtful about the impact. Where does the brine go? Can we make use of the salts that come out of the desalination process? What downstream building products can we make or use with those salts? And we have to be thoughtful about where it's done. I think one of the big opportunities in desalination is to start thinking less about seawater desalination, although there are places where you can do seawater desalination, and much more about brackish groundwater desalination. There's hundreds of millions of acre feet of brackish groundwater that can be tapped into, which has much lower salt concentration, and it's distributed. It's in the places where you need it. It's in inland states, it's in places like the Central Valley. So yeah, that's kind of where I see the biggest opportunity is in what we call decentralized or distributed desalination.
Yeah, and listeners, if you're interested in this topic, I mean, I definitely recommend checking out Mark Reisner's book, Cadillac Deserts. The whole history of the Bureau of Reclamation dives into Mulholland and LA and just all the history of this. If you're at all interested in the topic, it's absolutely a fascinating read, kind of how we got to where we are. Even though it's 30 years old, it's still a fantastic book on the subject.
Absolutely.
Where do you like? What needs? Or are there certain actors? I mean, is it just going to take a kind of like just improvements to water markets? Are you going to need a major tech company, major state government or locality to really kind of create an environment where desal happens? I mean, if you can kind of walk through how you see a lot of these larger projects getting financed and water credits, and just how do you kind of get from where we are today to a functioning water market, I guess?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. I mean, I don't know if I have the exact answer, but I'm certainly exploring all the different avenues from the market side to the
Yeah.
regulatory side to the kind of corporate side. But I think at a macro level, I think it needs to happen exactly the way that renewable energy scaled. I mean, renewable energy scaled, for a variety of reasons. One is that there were a lot of incentives. There were tax incentives, there were renewable energy credits, there were other state incentives because we really wanted to grow the renewable energy base. We wanted to create things like renewable portfolio standards, where we're going to say a certain amount of the power in the state has to come from renewable sources. I think for starters, we need to have something like that for desalination. We need to say, okay, we're serious about water, and we want to make sure that over the next 20, 30, 40 years, a certain percentage of the water supply is going to actually come from making new water from saltwater sources, whether it's brackish or seawater or even industrial sources that can be recycled. And then that's basically what countries like Israel do. Beyond that, I think once there's sort of a market signal, which is one of the things that's missing, because water right now is a heavily subsidized resource. Right? I mean, most people just expect to turn the tap on. They don't expect to pay very much for it. A lot of farmers expect to get it for free because they always got it for free, historically. And so we need to create sort of a different market signal that we value water, that we're going to create incentives for it, and that we want people to build the ability to desalinate or recover, salt water, if they have it. And then beyond that, I think there's a really cool opportunity to do sort of distributed desalination plants directly with corporates, especially corporates that are going to be building large-scale infrastructure projects for data centers and stuff like that. And I think if you look on the energy side, the amount of corporate buying from companies like Amazon, Facebook, Google, all the big tech companies, had a huge impact on scaling solar and wind. And I think if we had something similar to that for water, where if companies are going to develop a data center and they're going to develop the energy to support the data center, they're also going to directly enter into purchase contracts to buy desalinated water. I think that would be a way to sort of, get around the conservative nature of water utilities, which, don't do a lot of innovation. They don't necessarily invest in desalination technology. And I think that's the kind of shortcut that the desal space really needs. We have corporates that say, listen, if the water utility is not going to make it happen and they're not going to invest in technology, we're just going to go out into the market and do it ourselves. And I actually think it would be huge because um, I think over time what would happen is that corporates would realize that desalination is actually a tool. It's not a burden where you just all of a sudden pay more money for water. It's actually a tool to be in control of your own destiny. I mean, right now, a lot of these big tech companies are getting sued by local communities because they're pulling water from, hundreds of miles away to these data centers. If they had more control over developing, wherever they want to develop, and they could do it without impacting the local water supply or even providing excess water that goes back to cities and communities because they invest in desalination. I think it would make their lives a lot easier, and I think they'd find that it really kind of opens up, where you can do development, where you can build data centers. So
Yeah.
that's what I'm hoping happens is that desalination kind of moves away from being like this, sort of burden to something where we view it as an incredible tool to just completely increase our productivity, building new cities, expanding agriculture, being able to do, all this, we're talking now about onshoring all of the, manufacturing base that we've lost over the last several decades. I mean, that's a big deal. I mean, that's going to
Yeah.
require an enormous amount of raw resources. And so, I think desalination can help with a lot of that.
Agreed. To wrap up here, just pivoting to our founder questionnaire, just a series of rapid fire questions here. I think you've done these before when we did your interview or your Prime Movers founder interview years ago for the blog. So you'll get to redo any answers here if you've been giving it thought over the last few years. What's most important to you in life?
Mm. I think honestly, I learned very early on when I starting companies that it's not a sprint. When you're young, you think it's a sprint,
Yeah.
and so you just come out of the gate absolutely firing. It's not even a marathon; it's an ultra marathon, and so you got to pace yourself. You got to focus on your family. You got to take care of your health, because otherwise you can get burned out very quickly. So I mean, that was probably maybe the hardest lesson to learn is that you really got to slow down, pace yourself, and focus on the things that really matter in life.
What was the least expected challenge you had to overcome to reach, as a founder? I mean, that's kind of an answer for that question as well. Was there anything else that you did not expect you'd have to be dealing with as a founder of a startup?
I think probably the most unexpected thing was the timelines. When
Yeah.
I first started doing this, clean tech, green tech, it wasn't even a thing. My buddies and I, when we started out, we just saw this massive opportunity in the energy landscape changing, and all this technology that was sitting on the shelf that nobody was using. And so we looked at it like any other business opportunity. Now, it's this massive industry. We have companies being started all over the place, but the amount of time that it's taking, just to get to the point where some of these technologies are entering the market, I think way longer than anything I would have anticipated. And yeah, I mean, that's back to why you need to pace yourself because you think it's going to happen overnight, but it really ends up taking a very long time.
What's something you look for in an investor? I mean, you need to be kind of discerning yourself. I mean, it's not just on the VC to be doing due diligence. The founders need to be doing due diligence on who they're accepting money from and what the partnership will be, because it's going to be a relationship for quite some time. So I'm curious, if you've dealt with a lot of investors over the years. I mean, what's something you're looking for when you're going out to raise money?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, these days I think it's a lot easier because firms like yourselves that are really set up to to invest and handle and help these types of deep tech companies that are investing in infrastructure and energy and things that don't scale like AI. But early on, those firms didn't exist. So it was trying to find people that are willing to stick with it over a long period of time, large amounts of capital, and understand how difficult it is. And so yeah, I mean that's one of the reasons why I'm super happy to work with Prime Movers because I think you guys have a lot of very similar, obviously have a lot of very similar companies in the portfolio. But yeah, I look for people that Um, I look for people that I think have a really big vision about what we can achieve. Because I think when I look at sort of the state of the country right now, I think one of the most important things that we've really lost is I'm not sure that we collectively believe that we can build massive things and think really big like we used to. I mean, when I think about things like, like the Hoover Dam and the Manhattan Project, I don't know if we truly believe that we can, transform the American West once again. And I think we need to get back to that. And so, yeah, I mean, I look for investors that feel similar, that we can actually return to this era of American greatness where, yeah, we can completely transform the country. We can build new cities. We can do things that we never thought were possible. Because I think in a lot of ways, there's this feeling that we've kind of like peaked, and then we have kind of this like environmental overhang. We say we're using too much resources, we need to back off, too much water. And I don't think that's the case. I think we can actually use technology to completely reinvent ourselves again. And hopefully that's sort of what's happening.
What's a breakthrough you see happening between today and 2050? Maybe something in geothermal, um, in water desal, or it can be in any other sector. Something you're really excited about coming to fruition.
Yeah, I mean, in geothermal, the biggest thing for me is we need to get past what's called the transition zone. Is the rock transition zone is the part of the Earth's crust where rock starts to behave and become more ductile, less brittle, much more heat. It's the part of the crust that traps the heat. It's not naturally permeable. And it's sort of like this psychological barrier. Right now, there's a lot of geothermal companies that kind of want to figure out how to do it shallow, keep the temperatures modest, leverage oil and gas technology so that we can just, iterate and drill, drill, drill. But I think the transition zone really is a massive technological hurdle. And if we can get beyond it, I think, all of the data that's in that MIT geothermal report will actually come to fruition because there's an absolutely enormous amount of heat that can be produced.
Um, Lastly, but not least, I mean, it's always my favorite question. Have you read anything lately that's inspired you? What's on your nightstand? Any good book recommendations for our listeners?
What's on my nightstand? Most of the books I've read recently have been sort of informational. I think the book that I read that was, at least for me, inspirational was Hillbilly Elegy, because I think he has actually a really unique perspective on America. He obviously came, from nothing and was able to totally scale to, an incredible career. That was an inspiring book to read. And what else? I'm reading Tryptamine Palace, which is all about the effects of DMT on the brain and
Okay.
psychedelics and stuff like that.
Interesting. Yeah, both interesting. We'll try to find links for both of those for the notes section of this podcast.
Yeah,
Aaron, thank you again so much. Really appreciate your time coming on to do this and fascinating conversation. Thank you again.
yeah, yeah. Thanks for having me.